Troy Andersen's improvement can unlock the Falcons' defense's full potential.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. So, guys, if you don't know me, I'm your very humble host, Aaron Freeman, a.k.a. Mr. Drew, a.k.a. Sirius Black, a.k.a. the Jolly Green Giant, a.k.a. the iron that sharpens the iron, a.k.a. Mr. a.k.a. And, of course, I've been covering the Atlanta Falcons for better part of 18 years now. I like to say 15 because it makes me feel a little bit younger, but it's actually 18 years talking about this team, formerly at falcfans.com, RIP, still going strong on this illustrious podcast each and every day. And I appreciate each and every one of you that is an everydayer of this pod that makes it your first listen, your first watch each and every day. All you got to do to become an everydayer, subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So the bulk of today's episode, we'll be talking about Troy Andersen and his breakout potential. But in order to really set up that conversation, we got to revisit the tried and true, Mr. Drew pass rush concern, right? Last year, for the first time in 20 years, the Falcons broke 40 sacks, right? In part due to their investing resources into their pass rush, going out there and getting veterans like Calais Campbell and Bud Dupree and David Onyemata. And we sat here this time last year being like, hey guys, this is going to be, the best chance that this team has to break 40 plus sacks. They wound up breaking 40 plus sacks. I don't think that's a coincidence that they actually invested resources in their pass rush and they improved their pass rush. But this offseason, they lost Bud Dupree and David Onyemata, and they lost 13 sacks. And now we're trying to look for a way to kind of get back to that 40 sack, because now that we've gotten a taste of 40 sacks, which was still a below average pass rush, we don't want to regress. We don't want a 38 sack season. We don't want a 28 sack season moving forward. And so we need to find ways to get this pass rush upgraded without the investments, and a lot of that is based off of internal development from players. We talked yesterday about Arnold Ebiketie potential to be one of those guys internally that shows growth potential, and while the stats suggest there's huge growth potential for him, with Arnold Ebiketie having 6 sacks, only playing a third of the snaps last year, the assumption being, hey, if he plays 2/3 of the snaps this upcoming season like Bud Dupree did last year, maybe he'll be able to double his sack potential. But unfortunately, the film doesn't necessarily correlate to that, because, when you look at Arnold Ebiketie's, how he was able to get that production, most of it was, cleanup sacks, unblocked, pressure, stunts, scheme pressure, very little of that production where we're looking at his sacks and his quarterback hits were him beating offensive tackles. And so that may limit his growth potential. Right now, we're still hopeful that Arnold Ebiketie is going to improve with increased playing time and improve that sack production. But the notion of him doubling his sack production with, double the snaps doesn't look as optimistic, or at least for me, based off of his production profile as it would appear on paper. But, I don't think it's all up to Arnold Ebiketie, right? Because we've known in the past when the Falcons have bet on that internal growth from young pass rushers like Vic Beasley and Takk McKinley, that hasn't really worked out in their favor. And that sense of deja vu that you've all had seeing this movie, like, this feels a lot like, the 2018 and 2019 off seasons when the Falcons were so reliant on some of that internal growth that didn't pay off for them. That feeling of deja vu that you're getting, just suppress it, right? Because we got to be positive here on the podcast, and there's no negativity here on this podcast here. But the point is that Arnold Ebiketie's probably not going to be able to do it all on his own. And, we sat here 6 months ago thinking, hey, we're one 10-sack edge rusher away from sort of being the final piece to this puzzle in defense. That's probably not 100% true, but it certainly was the biggest piece missing from this Falcons defense. And the Falcons basically were like, no, we're good, right? And so rather than counting on that one edge to get you 10 sacks. Maybe the Falcons are really counting on like 3 or 4 guys to get you those 10 sacks to really improve the roster, just to get kind of to break even again, because we lost 13 sacks this offseason. So if we're getting 13 sacks from those 4+ guys, like we're just sort of treading water, which again, beggars can't be choosers. But that isn't an improvement, but boy, that would be such a positive relative to where this Falcons pass rush has been for the last 2 decades. So, if Ebiketti's not going to be, he's going to be 1/4 of those improvements. It's going to be who are going to be some of those other guys. And I think one of those guys is potentially Kaden Elliss, right? That could provide a big boost and sort of, chip away at, that sort of regression potential and make it so that it's, we get closer to progression instead of regression. But in order for Kaden Elliss to really be fully unlocked as a pass rusher, I think a lot of it is dependent on Troy Andersen being fully unlocked as a coverage player. And that's where we're going to turn our attention to talk more about Troy Andersen and what his growth potential is due to his unique skill set when it comes to coverage and potentially also contributing to the pass rush. And we'll break that down as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. Guys, Gametime is making getting NBA final tickets easier and faster, and the prices on Gametime's app go down the closer you get the tip off. And I know, you may be sitting here thinking like, I can't get NBA finals tickets, but Gametime is helping you take the guesswork out of buying tickets, whether it's for the NBA finals, whether it's for other sports, concerts, comedy, music, theater near you. Their last minute deals allow you to save up to 60% on those last minute tickets. Their lowest price guarantee is going to mean that Gametime is going to credit you 110% the difference if you can find cheaper tickets in the same section in a row. And they also have flash deals, which means, you get those exclusive in-app deals on select seats ahead of the game. So take the guesswork out of buying NBA finals tickets with Gametime by downloading the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNFL, LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off. Download Gametime today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. So, guys, before we talk more about Troy Andersen, I want to tell you about the Locked On Sports Today 24/7 free streaming sports channel, giving you that can't miss analysis, stories, the biggest stories, news and opinions for free, streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app. If you're looking for more local can't miss analysis and stories, check out Locked On Sports Atlanta on these same platforms, YouTube and the free Amazon Fire TV channels app. Of course, it's all part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So Troy Andersen has a unique skill set based off of his athleticism, his coverage potential, his speed, his range. I know there's a vocal minority of Falcon fans that are not necessarily the biggest fans of Troy Andersen. Some of those people are very, if they're anti-Andersen, they're pro Nate Landman. And I think Nate Landman did an admirable job given the circumstances last year. I think he's a high caliber backup. I don't really see him as a long-term option as a starter due to limitations. And those limitations are based around his skill set, right? Like as a downhill in the box run defender, Nate Landman, is awesome. But if you're asking him to do literally anything else defensively, he's pretty meh at that. And, my charting of the defense last year showed that he was 7 times as likely to give up an explosive play when targeted in coverage compared to someone like Kaden Elliss. Also, because of his limited speed, 4.86 40 time that he ran coming out of Colorado a couple of years ago. Like if you're asking him to make plays against the run outside the boxes, sideline to sideline, outside the hashes, he's not as capable of doing those types of things. And we've talked before when we drafted Troy Andersen, and whether he winds up living up to this remains to be seen. And certainly I think there's reasons to be skeptical whether he'll live up to this. But we talked about how if you can develop Troy Andersen, the best version of the type of linebacker that he is Fred Warner. And when you contrast that with Nate Landman, the best version of the type of linebacker that I think Nate Landman is Denzel Perryman. And while Andersen may never get close to being Fred Warner, one of those guys is arguably the best linebacker in the NFL and one of the top defenses in the NFL in Fred Warner. And the other one in Denzel Perryman is kind of a journeyman player that's played on 4 different teams over the last 4 years, even though he's made a Pro Bowl in that period of time, because of the very flawed Pro Bowl voting process. But, like that's a player that is more of a journeyman. That's not a sort of, linchpin centerpiece of your defense that you build around, right? And so again, I like Nate Landman, but as a backup. And I think this defense's full potential gets unlocked with Troy Andersen due to the coverage potential that he adds to the defense, right? Not only are you getting a player that may be our best matchup guy when it comes to some of the top tight ends that we're going to face this year, and you just look at the first 3 games where we got Pat Freiermuth and Dallas Goedert and Travis Kelce, and then later in the season, you got guys like Brock Bowers and TJ Hawkinson coming to town. Troy Andersen probably is the best option to match up with those guys because other than him, it's basically Richie Grant, and we saw that didn't go great for most of last year, right? And then I think if you can get Troy Andersen to sort of pick up the slack in coverage, that's going to allow Kaden Elliss to do what he does best, which is rush the quarterback, right? That was part of the problem with Nate Landman being in the lineup last year, is that you asked Kaden Elliss to have to cover guys like TJ Hawkinson, Alvin Kamara, and Sam Laporta last year, because you certainly didn't think Nate Landman was capable of doing those things. And Elliss, while I think he's functional in coverage and did a functionally good job last year, given that coverage assignment, that is not what he does best. Getting after the quarterback is what he does best. And I think, if Andersen lives up to his immense potential, again, that remains to be seen, but I will certainly die on this hill that this Falcons defense's ceilings is 10 times higher with Troy Andersen starting games than it is with Nate Landman. And, when we talk about Kaden Ellis's ability to get after the quarterback, having Troy Andersen take up a bigger part of that coverage slack will allow Kaden Elliss to potentially get after the quarterback more opportunities to rush the quarterback. And I'm not going to bore you with the math I wind up doing, but essentially, if we get a healthy Troy Andersen that can sort of do the coverage stuff that we need to do, I think a fairly conservative estimate, in terms of what Kaden Elliss can do with, potentially, doing the math, getting 65 or so more pass rush opportunities this year just from having a healthy Troy Andersen alongside him. And so basically, almost 4 more snaps a game, that could result in, potentially 15 more pressures. And you do the math on sort of Kaden Elliss historically and how many pressures he converts into sacks, that could lead to like 3.5 more sacks this upcoming season. That he adds to, I think, the 4 sacks he had last year. So Kaden Elliss is another guy. We talked about Arnold Ebiketie being a guy that has that 6 to 8 sack potential. I think Kaden Elliss is also in that 6 to 8 sack range, and that will do a lot to, chip away at this Falcons pass rush that we are oh so desperate, or at least we all should be oh so desperate to see this team continue to build after seeing progress there for the first time in basically 20 years last year. And not to mention Kaden Ellis's impact as a pass rusher, getting more of those opportunities. You also get Troy Andersen's potential impact as a pass rusher, although that's not going to be his primary role in passing downs. He should get some opportunities, roughly, 60 or so opportunities. And again, probably 15 or so pressures added to the defense. And you look at sort of his sack conversion rates, or the average sack conversion rate of a linebacker with 15 pressures, that roughly is about 2.5 sacks. So to me, doing the math, and again, I won't bore you with the details of that as your eyes glaze over when I just throw numbers at you. But basically, I think healthy seasons from Troy Andersen and Kaden Elliss could potentially add like 6 sacks back to your pass rush. And that's what we mean when we talk about sort of the internal growth, right? That internal growth potential is there if you can get, another 2 or 3 sacks from Arnold. If you get another 6 sacks from Troy Andersen and Kaden Elliss, now you're at like 8 or 9 sacks. And so again, you're like 4 or 5 sacks away. The rookies potentially are 4 or 5 sacks. And so that's the path, guys, to potentially this pass rush, not only, treading water and getting another 42 sack season, but potentially growing there if you can get that type of internal growth. So while I don't necessarily love that the Falcons are once again betting on internal growth, there is a path, especially if a healthy Troy Andersen is out there, that Troy Andersen truly can, if he can be that sort of difference maker in coverage that will allow Kaden Elliss to be a more impactful pass rusher, that can get you a ways to sort of breaking even when it comes to the pass rush. But we'll wrap up today's episode talking about whether or not Troy Andersen, will break out this year, right? Because this last year was supposed to kind of be his growing pain season. And this year, now has to be that due to the injury that he suffered that caused him to miss most of 2023 season. And can the Falcons afford Troy Andersen to have that sort of up and down growing pace season, given his lack of experience at the position? And we'll break that down as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. Guys, this next segment is brought to you by our sponsor, BetterHelp. And sometimes we all need the opportunity to get something off our chest, big or small. Certain things can really start to get to you, and it's important to let that out, especially to someone who is unbiased in your life. And for many of you guys, you are that unbiased person in my life because I have a microphone and I get to vent my frustrations about the Falcons' lack of investments in their pass rush, right? That's a little bit of things that I need to get off my chest on a daily basis, that we're sitting here for the 20th year in a row where this Falcon team just refuses to invest in their pass rush, and we're just supposed to say, hey, it's going to be great, it's going to work this time. But hey, not everybody has a podcast that they can vent their frustrations to their listeners, whether they are willing to listen to it or not. And that's why therapy can help you, right? Your therapist is willing to listen to you, and it can be different for everyone. Most of us have bigger problems than our favorite sports team not investing in their pass rush, and it's important to get those things off your chest every once in a while. So if you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online, it's convenient, flexible, it's designed to be suited to your schedule. Visit BetterHelp.com/lockedon to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/lockedon. So let's talk about Troy Andersen's breakout potential. And despite my hope and my optimism, right, what little I have for Troy Andersen's potential, I don't know if, similar to the conversation we had yesterday, if the odds are really stacked in Troy Andersen having that type of breakout year, right? And mostly because of the potential growing pains from having a young, inexperienced linebacker like Troy Andersen, right? We were hoping that last year was going to be kind of that growing pain season where we would see the ups and downs of Troy Andersen. We kind of knew that was going to be so. We got, flashes in the first couple of weeks of the season. He was healthy for that week 1 game, missed the week 2 game, came back for the Lions game, then suffered that torn pec at the end of that Lions game, and we never saw him again. But we saw flashes of Troy Andersen in those 2 games that he played before he got injured. But we know that Troy Andersen is, a kind of raw piece of clay that the Falcons are hoping to mold into a good linebacker due to his lack of experience playing linebacker at the collegiate level at Montana State. He only really played 2 years of linebacker there. The other years he was playing quarterback and running back for that team. Expressing that tremendous athleticism that he has. But, in the NFL, he's basically played 620 snaps through 2 years, which is basically the equivalent of like 10 starts in the NFL. And so basically he's now had, let's say, 1 year of NFL experience coupled with the 2 years of linebacker experience. This is kind of his 4th year playing linebacker. And we know, most of the linebackers that come in the NFL, will have 4 years of experience playing in college before they get to the NFL. And so this year is kind of essentially the equivalent for what most other linebackers experience, like his senior year of college playing the linebacker position. And so that's why it's hard to be super hyped about Troy Andersen just kind of hitting the ground running, because we know that, there's a big jump from college to the pros, right? For him to be an NFL linebacker. And right. And like last year should have been that year. And so this year would have been, kind of his full season, his first full season of playing NFL football. And so it would have been a little bit more realistic that he could potentially hit the ground running this upcoming season. And so you kind of need him to kind of not go through the ups and downs that you're kind of expecting at this point in stage of his career, if this defense is going to reach its full potential. And so now it's like the expectation is like this year's going to be his growing pain season. We talked about this yesterday on the podcast of how the Falcons are looking at 10 or more players on rookie contracts on the defensive side of the ball, expecting those guys to make leaps. And we know that like having that much reliance on youth is usually not a good strategy, because we know that young players tend to make mistakes, right? There are good things, there are flashes, there's potential. We saw that all with so many, you've seen that over the years with so many of these young players coming in, and you see the flashes in that first year or second year for these guys. But oftentimes, you also see the downside of that. And, it's not to sit here and say that you can't have a young defense that can be good, right? We saw the Chiefs do this 2 years ago, winning Super Bowl, asking a lot of young players, a lot of rookie contributors back in 2022, a lot of second and third year guys contributing on that defense side of the ball, right? But what did the Chiefs have going for them? They had one of the most explosive offenses in the NFL. They had Steve Spagnuolo, arguably the best defensive coordinator currently working in the NFL. You saw a similar situation with the Rams last year, right? But again, what did the Rams have last year? One of the top 10 offenses in the NFL. You had a very good defensive play caller, Raheem Morris. Now, obviously, we now have Raheem Morris, although Jimmy Lake's going to be calling plays, but we're just going to assume that, Jimmy Lake is going to be just as capable as Raheem Morris when it comes to calling our defense, because what else do we have in terms of hope and optimism for this upcoming season? But to me, what's interesting about, the 2022 Chiefs defense, as well as the 2023 Rams defenses that were relying heavily on these young players, is both of those teams had a Hall of Fame defensive tackle in the middle, sort of being the sort of guy that you could rely on week in and week out to be that dominant presence in Chris Jones and Aaron Donald. And we're sitting here being like, hey, maybe we can get, sort of that from Grady Jarrett again this year. We haven't really seen Grady play at that level since the first half of the 2022 season. But again, maybe he can bounce back coming off the ACL tear. Again, I don't love that bet, but what are we going to do? Again, this is it. And it's like, okay, well, maybe if Grady Jarrett isn't all the way there, isn't on the Chris Jones, Aaron Donald level, right, then maybe Grady Jarrett plus David Onyemata will be good enough to be, just be half as good as those guys, and combine them together, and you'll get that type of performance. And so it is interesting. Point being, we need good D tackle play, right? We need that. Basically, the point I'm trying to make is you need that one sort of dominant presence, seemingly, right, up front. And in both cases, in the Chiefs and Rams cases, it's been a D tackle, and we're hoping that we can get that dominant presence up front. You need good play calling, and you need a top 10, if not top 5 offense, right? That's the formula for success for the teams that have been able to successfully navigate the ups and downs of having a young defense, right? The Chiefs in 22, the Rams in 23, and we're hoping the Falcons can throw into that. And again, there's reasons to be hopeful about that, but it just doesn't feel right. Again, it's just it's the difference between having Chris Jones and Aaron Donald and what the Falcons currently have at D tackle. And then we'll just sort of have to see if the Falcons offense is on the same level as last year's Rams offense, as the previous year's Chiefs offense. But we'll just sort of have to see. But I do think, getting back to Troy Andersen, he's kind of the embodiment of this defense, right? He's a great gauge or litmus test for what this defense is going to be. That if he's up and down, I think that's what this defense is going to be. It's going to be up and down, right? And again, I'm not trying to sit here and say every game that Troy Andersen has a good game, the defense will play well, and every bad game that he has, the defense won't. But it will be they'll probably be related, right? There will be a correlation between those two things. He just really embodies sort of the growth potential of this defense, but also the inconsistency that you sort of expect from this defense. And we're, again, hoping that this coaching staff and scheme can sort of elevate Troy Andersen. But in a lot of ways, we're betting on youth and inexperience, and Troy Andersen kind of embodies that. And so how he goes, I think, will be a good indicator of how this defense goes overall this upcoming season. So I'm excited by Troy Andersen's growth potential. It just feels like the timing isn't quite as good as you would ideally want it, that he really needed to be healthy last year so that this year you could go into this season feeling okay, he worked out all the kinks in his game, and now he's ready to be that more consistent player that we're hoping to see in the middle of this defense from a coverage standpoint, from a run defensive standpoint, all those various things. And instead, we're probably going to get the sort of, growing pains type of year that we thought last year was expected to be. And so that doesn't fill me with a ton of hope and confidence and optimism, but we'll just sort of have to see, right? That's what it's going to boil down to. So AK and Troy Andersen, I think, both have lots of potential. I'm not sitting here as optimistic and maybe as others that those guys are going to be, standouts, or at least be the reliable playmakers. But I'm starting to basically think, as we probably continue talking about several of these other 10 plus bets that the Falcons are making on the defensive side of the ball, that it's not going to be about one guy being that sort of reliable week in and week out contributor. It's just going to be like some weeks it's going to be this guy, and some weeks it's going to be this guy, and some week, and it's just kind of, they just kind of take turns, and hopefully the collective sort of adds up for the whole, so to speak. The sum is greater than the sum of its parts or whatever. And it's kind of, to me, kind of what the pass rush is going to be for this defense, where you just kind of like hope that 2 sacks from this guy and 3 more sacks from this guy and 2 more sacks from this guy, it just kind of adds up over time. And you're just like, okay, like we were able to kind of just piece it together. And it'll be fine. Again, it'll be fine. It's like, yeah, it's going to be fine, right? Just Zach Robinson, just please do a good job, and it'll be fine. And as long as we have that stable force on the offensive side of the ball, it'll probably be fine on defense. That's probably what's going to be. We really need that stabilizing force on the offense to be able to trust that the offense is going to come out each week and be able to score a lot of points, because there's going to be some weeks where this defense is going to play well, and there's going to be some weeks when they don't play well. And we'll just sort of have to see. And, once again, having an unreliable pass rush is usually not a formula for success, but again, positivity, guys. Yeah, so we'll just grin and bear it. And we'll just smile through it, and they'll be good, right? They'll definitely be good. We definitely don't need to be sitting here talking about them investing more resources in their pass rush, just like we definitely, sitting here last year talking about them investing more resources into their wide receiver room. That didn't necessarily come to fruition. It's not like the Falcons decided 6 weeks into the season that they needed to go and trade and get a more explosive wide receiver. No, they didn't need to do that. And that the guy that they were counting on to be their number 2 wide receiver the entire summer, wound up being their number 5 wide receiver. Like that definitely didn't happen last year. So it's going to be fine, right? It's definitely going to be fine this year with the pass rush and with the offense, and definitely, yeah. So it's all good, right? Like, hey, just smile and it's gonna be great, guys. Yep, can't wait. So we'll see what happens. Falcons did pick up an offensive lineman today, Andrew Stuber. Maybe that's the solution to the guard problem that we talked about last week on the podcast, where I was like, hey, maybe we should try to upgrade our guard depth. It's like, the Falcons like, no, but maybe they do that today. So it's like, hey, we're taking steps. We're trying to be better. So let's just see if this keeps rolling, and we definitely won't be going into this year's trade deadline talking about the Falcons trading for a pass rusher. That's definitely not going to happen, because Arnold Ebiketie, Troy Andersen, and Kaden Elliss are definitely stepping up, and we'll see who else is going to step up. Maybe we talk about Zach Harrison tomorrow. No, let's talk about the secondary. Let's talk about Clark Phillips or somebody like that. Yeah, we'll definitely be optimistic, or Richie Grant or somebody like that. One of these guys is definitely going to step up and be the solution to our problems this year. Yeah. Yes. So stay tuned for that. We'll potentially talk about that later this week. Keep talking about, the defensive breakout potential, and sort of try to get you a realistic portrait of what this defense is going to be this year. All right. And it's going to be great. Definitely going to be great. So that's what you have to look forward to as your first listen throughout the week. For your second listen, check out Locked On Sports Today, Locked On Sports Atlanta, Locked On Hawks, Locked On Braves, Locked On Bulldogs, Locked On NFL, Locked On NFL Draft, Locked On NFL Scouting. I'm sure summer scouting is starting for several of those guys now that June is here. So if you want to get geared up for that edge rusher that we definitely won't be talking about the Falcons needing to use a first round pick on in next year's draft, you just want to listen for, S's and G's. Go check out Locked On NFL Draft for that. Yeah. So, all right, guys, that's it for your first listen. Check out those shows for your second listen. It's all part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.